Anyway, back to the ranch here. So we've got this energy balance, and you can see now if we can feed this ration for these bugs, what happens then is that you produce this big, huge population. You heard about the soil food web. You know, this big, massive population of bacteria and protozoa that live on the bacteria that recycle all these nutrients. Now you've got bacterial protein, and that's where your real bypass protein comes from. It comes from the huge population explosion of these microbes in the rumen. And that's exactly what we're doing if you can produce A, quality protein, and B, you can produce energy in the form of sugars, pectins, beta-glucans, fructans, organic acids, and so forth. So you can see plant carbohydrates, here's the kinds that you really want to produce. You have the cell contents inside the cell, and you have the cell wall. And you can see that the pectin substance, galactans, and beta-glucans, they're the ones that are in the cell wall, and yet they're considered under the NFC. NFC is a group of the really fermentable, quickly fermentable energy sources that are in forages. So you have organic acids, you have these other sugars, you have a little bit of starches, you have these fructans, which are sugar-like compounds, and then you've got these pectic substances, but they come from the cell wall, but they ferment so readily like these other things that they actually are classified as NFCs, which are, another word for them is non-structural carbohydrates. So, and then you've got over here, cellulose and hemicellulose, which is your non-detergent or neutral detergent fiber and your acid detergent fiber. So this is where you get your energy. And the only way you can get the energy in this form, in this concentration, in this variety, is with good soil agronomic principles. And then again, you can see in terms of pH, you know, these are the ones right here, the pectics and the beta-glucans, they decrease at low pHs. So even if you are providing those raw materials for rumen energy from these sources that we want, by growing the forages the right way, if you start throwing a lot of grain at that animal because you get greedy and you want that extra milk or you want that extra meat production on that animal, you drop the pH of that rumen to the point where you kill the organisms that use that as a raw material to substrate it. Now here's an example. Keep this in mind. 80% of a ruminant's energy can come from volatile fatty acids. Volatile fatty acids are those fatty acids that are synthesized in the rumen through fermentation. In other words, 80% of all the energy of any ruminant can be derived from the forages that you feed them, and the other 20% can come from the forages that don't produce the volatile fatty acids. So you don't have to rely on starch if you can make it right, you know. But like Gary always likes to use the phrase, you have to earn the right to get there. If you got poor quality forages and you want to put meat on an animal, you can't do it when you've got the kind of forages that the guys in Ohio and Eastern Oregon were producing. There's no energy and there's poor quality protein that consumes energy to get rid of the blood ammonia that is caused by that poor quality protein. But here you can see between a pH of 6.5 and 7, that this guy here, acetic acid, 60% of those volatile fatty acids should be acetic acid. What's another word for acetic acid? Vinegar. Yeah. Anybody ever remember people feeding vinegar to stock years ago? Yeah. And the reason for it is because it tones them up. You're priming the pump because that volatile fatty acid, acetic acid, is made by a healthy rumen that's living on nutrient-dense forages. That's why vinegar works. And people say, well, I don't understand that. Vinegar is an acid. I thought you want to keep the rumen pH between 6.5 and 7, which tends to be on the alkaline side or close to alkaline. Well, yeah, that's true. But vinegar is got 10 times the alkalinity that starch does when you ferment starch. In other words, when you ferment starch, you create a substance called lactic acid. Lactic acid is 10 times more acidic than acetic acid. So you could literally buffer an animal that's got acidosis with vinegar, and you will buffer an animal that has acidosis with vinegar. And this is what you can see here. What happens is, you know, when that pH starts to drop, this starts to drop. Propionic acid starts to kick up, which is the second volatile fatty acid, and that typically is about anywhere from 25%, anywhere 15 to 25% of the volatile fatty acids comes from propionic, and the third one is butyric, which isn't listed up here. So there are 3 major volatile fatty acids, and you want most of it to come from acetic acid because that's the healthy, most efficient acid of a healthy rumen. It's an ecosystem. Keep remembering that. Well, when you get down to 6, pH below 6, you can see it starts to climb. You produce this guy. Lactic acid is not a volatile fatty acid. And what it does, it actually becomes a poison to the microflora that live in that rumen. And now you end up with, back to that graph with that rumen graph, 2 back here. What happens here is, if you start dropping that pH down into the 5 to 5 range, which is what you'll see feedlot dairies and feedlot beef be in the 5 to 5 range, then you start producing all this lactic acid, and just like the overflow ammonia, it can penetrate through the rumen wall and ends up in the bloodstream, and now you create a condition known as metabolic acidosis. Relative to all your health in here, I can assure you that if you're sick, you're metabolically acidotic, and a lot of what's causing acidosis is lactic acid. And I'll go through some of that tomorrow. And if you want to stay healthy, you want to make sure that the lymphatic pHs are up between 6.4 and 7.2. The blood pH will stay at 7.4 at all costs, including cannibalizing your tissues. But that's the way it works, because alkalinity means oxygen. Acidity means lack of oxygen. So you've got to always keep that in mind, that if you are an oxygen-breathing organism, the last time I checked, I was, but if you're an oxygen-breathing organism, those cells have to have O2, and you can only alkalize, you can only oxygenate when you're alkaline. So when you have metabolic acidosis, the same thing that happens to cows is the same thing that happens to unhealthy people. Metabolic acidosis, so now you got the liver that's working to take care of the blood urea nitrogen. Now it's got to neutralize the acidity, and it's constantly converting these things into these other esters, these other fatty acid esters, to make them less toxic. So by the time you slaughter a cow, and you look at the culling age of dairy cows in the United States, 9 to 10 million cows. You know what the average age before they cull a cow out in the United States on the milking string? 42 to 44 months of age. That's not even 2 lactations. 44 to 42 months. Cows are lactated before they're 2 years old, and they're culled because they burn them up. And the reason why they burn them up is because the liver caves in, and when you open up a cow that's been culled because she can't breed back, and she's got laminitis, she's got all these health problems, you'll find out she's got a liver 95% of the time, maybe more than 95% of the time. 95% of the culled cow livers are condemned. And that's the reason why. So, and this is true with beef cattle or any kind of ruminant that you're trying to feed. Here we go. This was another way that they try to solve the problem, and it does solve the problem to a lesser or greater degree. It's called a total mixed ration, and the reason for that is because when they were slug feeding animals grain, they really caused problems because there was nothing but grain at that particular time in the rumen, and then the thing got completely acidic. So they said, okay, let's mix everything up. Let's put the hay chop in there. Let's put the buffer in there. Let's put the premix in there. Let's put the protein supplement in there. Let's put the corn in there. Mix it all up. Every bite has a little bit of everything. It doesn't cause so much acidosis. It does help. But here is an example, right here, 24-hour period of time, University of Wisconsin TMR ration on a dairy cow that they're feeding. And these are the meals, on the TMR meals, and you can see that 19 out of 24 hours of that cow's rumen is under the pH of 6. What's that matter? Well, when you get under the pH of 6, you are decreasing the beneficial rumen flora by about 14% an hour for every 1/10 of a point below 6.0 that you drive it. So you really are caving. That animal won't last in the milking string any more than that 42 to 44 months, because it's chronic acidosis that translates into chronic metabolic acidosis. So what do we do about it? How do we deal from the forage standpoint? These are numbers that when I look at, instead of looking at all these other parameters, these are the numbers that I like to look at. Here's the nitrogen levels. If you translate that into crude protein, you'll see you're in the low 20s. ADF, neutral detergent fiber. But here's where I really like to focus on, because if the minerals are here, you know, and these other scientists have proven this already. If these minerals are here, if we can get as close to 2% on calcium on these minerals, and by the way, this is as true on any crop that you're growing. I even do this on golf courses on bent grass. If we get these numbers in here, we have more disease resistance, more insect resistance, just better color, better senescence. The plants don't succumb to stress. And that's true now with this nutrient density. We keep this 2% up here. You can see that the phosphorus gets up close to 0.5%. The magnesium comes up close to 0.5%. The potassium stays about the same balance as potassium as with calcium. And then you get this sulfur ratio in there at the right levels, you find out you start making quality protein and you start producing the energy. The trace minerals should be right in line there. I think you have this in your handout so you don't have to take any notes. But when this all works together, you start making quality protein, you start making this real good energy in forages, and then you can watch within 1 week's time of feeding forages that look like this, you'll even see a change, a profound change in the behavior of the animals. They're settled down, they're not as willy-nilly, the manure changes right away, and oftentimes you'll see within the time you check for butter fats and milk solids, the quality of the protein. And that's a whole other thing. What's interesting to me about milk is that it's a really complicated chemical substance. There's a lot of things about milk chemistry that very few of us in this room understand or even are told about, but there's a lot of ways to determine what milk is based on what you feed these animals. And the same with meat. This is the way you produce CLA. This is the way you produce the alpha omega-3 fats. And this is the stuff people are going to want to be hearing about. They want to know about this alpha omega-3 and this conjugated linoleic acid, at your earliest convenience, because believe me, it's brand spanking new in terms of what people know about the individual nutrients. So calcium, and I won't beat this to death because you've been hearing it over and over again, but again, it's in addition to producing energy, it's a key element in the composition of proteins. So if you have calcium deficiency in the soils, plants tend to take up magnesium in lieu of calcium, and you end up having inferior protein compounds. That's one of the things that Albrecht found out, that you needed to produce, in order to produce quality protein, you need sulfur and you need calcium. And then calcium is also responsible for producing the pectates, which is where you get those energies that you've been hearing about. And of course, being that it's the trucker of all nutrients, you get those other benefits. As a matter of fact, it doesn't just truck nutrients in the cell, it trucks nutrients in the plants. Boron, obviously a synergist with calcium for calcium absorption, but again, in the animals, associated with the parathyroid hormone, and in humans. And this is real important if anybody who's concerned about arthritis and osteoporosis. This is one way to address that. One way to address that is make sure you get adequate levels of boron with a calcium-rich diet so that you can govern the parathyroid hormone, which regulates the level of calcium in the blood. One of the tricks that they use in the dairy industry, because there's an illness there called milk fever or hypocalcemia. Milk fever is a condition when you've got an imbalance during gestation and the calcium-phosphorus ratio gets out of whack. Well, in this case, most of the time these days, it's the calcium-potassium ratio gets out of whack. So when the cow comes fresh, she'll have a low blood calcium only not because there's necessarily a deficiency of calcium in the diet, but there's usually an excess of something else, and it's oftentimes potassium. It used to be phosphorus, but today it's oftentimes potassium. Well, rather than deal with it the way they need to deal with it, which is really correct the soil, because that's why these forages are so imbalanced, the soils are imbalanced, they sell you another product. What do? They sell you this thing called anionic salts. I call it, bovine Coca-Cola. That's what it is. Basically, it's a bunch of minerals that are acidic in nature. Cows eat this stuff, and it tends to push the blood pH down. Well, what's the story with blood pH? It won't go down. And how does it not go down? It cannibalizes or robs calcium out of the skeleton. So by doing that, the blood gets filled up with calcium so that you don't get hypocalcemia or milk fever. It was just a little trick they did, but they created sort of like an induced osteoporosis on the cow that really had to do with the soils issue. But most nutritionists don't really have any kind of understanding of soils, nor do they care to. They want to balance the ration with their software programs. And there was a guy that I used to travel with who's no longer with us and rode occasionally for Hordes Dairyman by the name of Mac McCullough. He was a dairy nutritionist out of the University of Georgia. And he said, it's gotten to the point today where with these computer programs, you can balance a ration using ground up fence posts and urea because, they never consult the cow, but that's what it boils down to, just energy and protein based on its simplest substances, carbon and nitrogen. You can balance a ration based on ground up fence post and urea. And that's almost as extreme as it's getting because nobody's looking at these soil connections. Now here, boron also shows you that it's obviously essential for sugar transfer in the plant. It's essential for calcium mobility throughout mammals which again, if you got calcium deposits, your doctor will say, oh, don't eat anything calcium-rich foods. Don't take any calcium supplements because you have calcium deposits. You got too much calcium in your system. What's happening is that calcium is no longer ionized. So you need to ionize calcium with vitamin D and good digestion and magnesium and these other trace minerals and boron. And then once it gets into the bloodstream, you need essential fatty acids to take it around, deposit it where it's needed. If you don't do that, if you don't have the calcium complex, as I call it, then precipitation occurs. It crystallizes, it falls out of solution and accumulates in the joints. So you really don't have a calcium excess. You probably have a magnesium deficiency, or maybe a boron magnesium deficiency, or maybe most likely a vitamin D deficiency, which of course they say stay out of the sun, you get skin cancer, but most people are getting skin cancer hanging out of fluorescent lights and putting sunscreen on. Did you know that the sunscreen industry actually has come forward and said that there's more people getting skin cancer that put on the screens than people who don't wear the screens? What is that all about? Why are people getting such high levels of skin cancer? Could it be that we don't have the antioxidant protection that keeps us from getting skin cancer? That's my theory on it. Anyway, you can see that this boron, one trace mineral, is also involved with tryptophan, which is an essential amino acid. So now we're talking about quality protein again. You can see as the boron levels increased in solution, the tryptophan levels increased. So we know the trace minerals are involved now making quality. Sulfur is the quality secondary nutrient making quality protein. There were some real interesting studies done at Virginia Tech in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and all they did, again, what amazes me about a lot of these charts and stuff that I have up here, they're very reductionist in their nature. I mean, they're just taking one element and comparing it against a control. And oftentimes, to me, that's a very incomplete test. It doesn't really give you enough information, but it still amazes me the kinds of results they get just by changing one thing. And in this case, all they changed was ammonium nitrate was changed to ammonium sulfate for fertilizing fescue grass, orchard grass, and sorghum, and it was tested on beef cattle and sheep. And on the beef cattle, they ended up increasing profits per calf by $44 per head on an 80-cent a pound rate, just by using ammonium sulfate to increase the quality of the protein in the grass that they in turn fed to the animals. They repeated the test with all three grasses, and then they did it with sheep, same consistency, and then they said, okay, what happens if we take just inorganic sodium salt and put that in the ration in the form of sodium sulfate, and they didn't get those results. So it wasn't just sulfur. It was sulfur basically turned into amino acids like methionine and cysteine and tryptophan. Not tryptophan. What's the other one? The one I just had there. Tryptophan. No, I want to go the other way. This is... Okay. So anyway, the digestibility of lignin also, this is another thing. You folks that are in hot weather, when I get this complaint every year, usually in the middle of the winter, you'll hear dairy farmers complain, my butterfat's gone down. And everybody's complaining on the same time. Everybody's butterfat depression. And the natural culprit usually is, it must be the dairy's ripping me off again. The creamery's taking the points there, because it's oftentimes happens that they'll dock you, just say instead of you having a 3.8 butterfat, they'll say you have a 3.6 butterfat. And everybody complains on the same time. And what's happened is that everybody's getting into the hay mow with that same hay that was cut at the same time, and it was usually in the dog days of August or something like that in July when we had some real hot weather. And what happens when you get real hot weather, the plant produces more lignin, which is like tree bark. It protects the plant from the heat extremes. And lignin is not degradable. It's not a soluble fiber that biodegrades into what? Acetic acid. What's the precursor to butterfat? Acetic acid. So it's the soluble fibers that make the acetic acid, which not only puts weight on animals and puts milk in the tank, but it also puts quality in the fat like butterfat. So that's what you'll see. Sulfur helps reduce that digest or increases the digestibility of lignin so that you don't have so much adverse effects. And in this hot climate down here, sulfur is important for that reason. Moly is another trace mineral. It's very important for making quality protein again. Why? Because it's associated with, again, it's a trace mineral associated with an enzyme. Again, all enzymes are affiliated with trace minerals. In this case, we're talking about nitrate reductase enzyme. And what happens is nitrogen that's in that plant needs to be converted into protein. And the way that's done is with this enzyme, and the core element of this enzyme is moly. And you can see here where this happened to be in cantaloupe plants, or what Gary calls stone melons. Stone melons, rock melons, we call them, well, these are cantaloupes anyway. But you can see grown in sandy soil, normal and deficient. See the nitrate levels, how high they are? These would be toxic levels. Same down here. This was a situation where they let it be deficient and then came back and sprayed Solubor, which is a soluble moly, on the leaves, and then brought it right back to almost normal. So moly is a very important trace mineral, except that sometimes you got to test for it and make sure you don't have excesses of moly. I had a dairy farmer one time in Ohio that had all kinds of health problems. We finally, fortunately, tested his soil for moly. And he had excesses of moly in there, and he was going to have to start doing some real corrections. Moly is very antagonistic to copper, and copper is an extremely critical trace mineral for the immune system and for hemoglobin production and for reproduction and so forth, for catalase production and a whole variety of enzymes are associated with copper. You'll have sick animals, you'll have unproductive, unthrifty animals with a copper deficiency. Moly at really high levels can antagonize copper. So what we did there is he just did a real simple thing. He moved to Kentucky instead of try to correct things. He sold the farm and bought another farm in Kentucky. No longer had the problem. Somebody else probably did though. So other macronutrients that tie into this high quality protein and high nutrient density, energy density forages are phosphorus, because again, ATP and ADP are associated with a phosphorus molecule. Magnesium is a catalyst in all these biochemical reactions and is associated with phosphorus and calcium absorption. And this is another one in our area. We've got a lot of animal units per acre. We produce a lot of manure per acre. We end up getting excessive amounts of potassium, and that excessive amount of potassium creates an imbalance where oftentimes the calcium is compromised and the potassium, luxuriant levels of potassium are taken up. Consequently, you end up with this calcium to potassium ratio that's very, very out of whack. In fact, it's so bad in a lot of cases that it's a brand new disease in the cattle industry called potassium toxicity. You feed a high potassium forage to dry cows, gestating cows, you will lose those cows when they come fresh. It's definitely deadly. So it's nothing but a mineral imbalance. And you'll have poor quality. There were studies that were done on potassium excesses in Wisconsin where they use, anywhere up to 1,000 pounds of potassium chloride per acre. 1,000 pounds of potassium chloride per acre ended up stripping the alfalfa, lucerne, of its energy, of its trace minerals, and even the protein quality went down just by putting on too much potassium. And you're buying that stuff. And that's one of the problems we have with lucerne, is there's this concept that lucerne's a big potassium accumulator, and it does. It has a fair amount of potassium in it, and it'll take up a lot if you keep feeding it. But it primarily likes calcium. You know, if you really want to get a good quality lucerne, fertilize it with calcium. Don't just lime the ground for pH on lucerne. It's a calcium feeder. It's a calcium critter. I live in a limestone belt that used to have 20 cement plants within a 20-mile linear distance from the Delaware River out to Whitehall, Pennsylvania, 20 cement plants. And years ago, Gary was talking about the calcium hydroxide, calcium oxide. Years ago, they used to just, before the Clean Air Act came into effect, they suck out this kiln dust because it's too high in alkali and it affects the quality of the concrete. So they used to suck this out, and they would just blow it up to stacks and let the wind carry it. I mean, everybody had lime or kiln dust all over their sidewalks, all over their cars. In fact, it got to be a problem because it would pit the paint because it's an alkali, it's a caustic when it gets wet. So eventually, you know, the EPA ended up stopping them from doing that. But there were 6 alfalfa dehydrating plants in the shadows of those 20 cement plants producing alfalfa this tall without ever putting anything on that ground, hardly at all. Because what do they get out of that kiln dust? They got sulfur, they got potassium, and they got soluble calcium, and they used to have dehydrating plants, and they would make dehydrated alfalfa and sell it as a protein source for the poultry industry, for egg producers up in New York State. And they were in business until just a couple of years ago. The last one just shut down a few years ago because nobody's getting free kiln dust anymore. So they got to buy this stuff or buy some other liming source. But that's how incredibly effective. No farmers in our area ever limed their ground. Didn't have to. It came out of the sky. If there was one pollution that I could say I wouldn't mind coming back, that's one of them, because it didn't do anything toxic other than make things cosmetically unattractive. This is the last couple of slides I have here, kind of detours a little bit. and it deals with diversity. I guess one of the things that discourages me, even when I go on organic farms, I really get discouraged when I see a lot of monoculture cropping. I mean, you go on the organic farms, they raise 3 crops. They raise alfalfa, they raise corn, they raise soybeans, and that's it. But it's organic, so everything's fine. To me, I don't call that organic. I think we really have to look at the diversity. Diversity begets more diversity. Each plant species has its own ecosystem of preference that lives in that root zone, because each plant exudes different chemicals into the soil that attract different kinds of microbes. Conversely, every plant is a phytochemical factory, and they produce hundreds of compounds unique to each species. They might have some similarities, but there's not just fiber and protein and energy in a plant. There's all these phytochemical compounds, of which today there's a whole new industry being based on that called the nutraceutical industry. The nutraceutical industry is paralleling the pharmaceutical industry because these phytonutrients, these chemicals that are just being discovered as we speak, have these profoundly unique, potent components and aspects to them that affect the immune system and so forth. So I like to see species diversity as much as possible. We were talking over lunch about a couple of plants like chicory and plantain. Chicory, Thomas Jefferson brought, now I don't know if you know who Thomas Jefferson was, but he was the 3rd president of the United States, and he was a real ecologist. He was a real farmer. His vision of the United States was going to be yeoman educated farmers that were going to live all over the place. Of course, he's spinning in his grave right now, but his idea was to have farmers that were educated, that were stewards, that could create economic prosperity and decentralized communities under our Constitution and Bill of Rights being the guarantor of that. And Thomas Jefferson brought chicory in from England at a time that was very unpopular because there was war brewing with England again after our independence. The War of 1812 eventually ended up coming into fruition as a consequence of these disagreements that we had with the Crown. And Jefferson was negotiating with some English people about the chicory thing that he wanted to bring over here. Well, he made such a scandal because he was negotiating with British merchants about bringing chicory over here. That is actually more scandalous than the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal was a few years ago. Just bringing chicory to the United States, but it grows all over the place right now. And also diversity-wise, when I was in Perth, one of Graham and Rose's connections, who's a South African inventor, came up the next day after this talk, and he handed me a 12-page article on mulberry as a fodder. And, of course, I have mulberry up here. One of the things I'll show you is plantain. You guys talk about plantain. One of the things you'll see about these plants is I didn't really know what they had beside medicinal values, because I put a lot of herbal preparations together for livestock, for horses, for canine animals, for other companies. I don't really sell those to those industries. And what I saw with the plantain was these incredible, I've got growing all over the place, these incredible rosettes growing in the most drought-stricken kinds of circumstances. So I said, I want to compare these nutritional density levels with alfalfa. And this is a good level of alfalfa, and this is the kind of stuff we're looking at on a forage. This is not a medicinal evaluation or a phytochemical evaluation. What this is just a nutritional density evaluation. Well, you come over here, and I saw this nettle leaf thing. Well, a number of years ago, I remember reading about nettle leaf. And nettle leaf, they were talking about in World War I, the Kaiser was losing the war. And one of the things that he wanted to do was have every farmer grow some nettle leaf. And I thought, why is that? And he goes on to say that you could put on more flesh with nettle than any other forage. Never explained why. And of course, the war machine in World War I was run by draft animals. They didn't have machines like they have today. They didn't have tanks and all these motorized vehicles. It was run by draft animals. So I wanted to find this out. Never could find it out. Well, sure enough, when I had the nettle leaf tested, and you come down here and you look at the calcium levels, 4.38% calcium, and you look at the sulfur levels, almost 1% sulfur, and a 4-to-1 nitrogen to sulfur ratio. We're very nutrient dense. See, so that's what we're finding out with these plants. And this is stuff that's growing in not soil. This is stuff growing on road banks, growing on railroad beds, places that transmutation of elements or some kind of mobilization and accumulation of these minerals is occurring. So then I ended up going to the woody plants. And like I said, this one guy brought up the mulberry leaf. Well, mulberry leaves were fed to what? Silkworms. So they actually grew silkworms for the purpose of product. Fiber, right? So silkworms were actually fed these mulberry leaves that had been bred to produce high nutrient density. Look at the mulberry leaf levels, and you see the same thing, 3% calcium, real nutrient dense substances. So what I'd like to emphasize, and I'm running out of time, and I can't spend as much time on this as I'd like to, is you really ought to look at your native plants, see what can fit in. Somebody mentioned the tree up here, a legume tree. It sounds almost sort of like lucerne. What's the name of it? Yeah. You know, I don't know what the nutrient value of it is, but I would look at plants like this because one thing about woody plants that are deep-rooted, they have a lot of drought resistance. A lot of drought resistance. You need to go deeper for water. You need to go deeper for minerals. Bring them up to the top, you know, and start figuring out ways to incorporate this kind of nutrient diversity in the form of plants that have the capability of fixing these nutrients. So anyway, I'm out of time. I'd like to talk a little longer, but I'm getting the sign. So thank you very much.